In this video, I just want to go over some of the features of some text editors. I'm not trying to promote one or the other. It's really up to you to choose the one that you want to use for the class or whatever you use it for. I'm going to talk about the one that I've been using lately and some of the other ones in general. But really it just takes time and to get used to one or the other and comparing what it is that you're what features that they offer, and if you like it or not. Then if you like it, use it. If you don't like it, then just keep looking until you find something else. I'm just using free versions of these text editors because I'm trying to make it as cost-effective as possible for the class. So Aptana Studio, Aptana, whatever the latest version is, if you watch this video, I find it to be pretty easy to use. I find it to have some pretty nice features, so that's the one I use. When you pull up Aptana, you're going to get a worker user face area that you're going to be working with. On the left side, you've got your Project Explorer, and when you make when you end up making your website definitions, you actually will be working out of the Aptana Studio. Will create a workspace for you called Aptana Studio Workspace, and in there you can put in your different websites. So for instance, if I have my own personal website, I will have my own personal website, or whatever I call it, CIS 152 or whatever, and inside of that will be all of the elements that I'll be using for that particular class. So I'll have my index page, my project pages, lectures, and this is where I'll have the hierarchical folders defined. So they'll all be coming out of the Aptana Studio Workspace itself. So if I wanted to make a new one, so when I start from scratch, I would go and I'd say I'd want to make a new web project, and then it gives me the ability to create a default project or something else. I usually go with just the default project without any sort of templates, but you can choose one with the boilerplate, which we'll talk about later. This basically just sets up all the relationships within the boilerplate. You got JavaScript, you've got all of your code that you'll be using for maybe Google Analytics and that sort of thing already in there. It's quite a nice hierarchical setup. If you're just starting from scratch like you would be for the class, you'd have just a basic web template. Actually, I'm just going to use the default and say next, and I can give it a name. I'm just going to say test website and use the default location. I'm going to say finish, and then when I go over here, I get a folder added to my Explorer. Now, if you wouldn't have anything when you're starting, but you'd start from here, and into that you would have essentially nothing. And what I would want to end up doing then, so if I went back to this folder, if I went back to my documents in my Aptana Studio folder, I would see there's the test website. Now, when I began writing my code, I would then be adding content to this, dropping in my images and that sort of thing. But what I'd want to do is set up my own hierarchy here. So I would want to add to it, I would want to say a new, right click and say I want to add a new file or folder. So if I wanted to add a new, say, images folder, I could do that. And now inside of there is my images. I'm selecting that. If I wanted to say a new folder for my CSS, I could do that. If I wanted to say, okay, now I'm going to write my index page, I'm going to write This is where I could go and say a new file. Then I can just call this file my index. Actually, I'm going to cancel that. Right click. And I want to put in I like to go new from template, because then I can go and say new HTML5, and I'll just use that as a basis, and I'll just call that, let's say I'm going to start that with my index. So I'll go there, and when I double click on that, I'll open it up over here, and what it does is that it gives me basically a layout of my HTML5 page. It's got my heading, my doc type, my HTML from here. And what I love about this is that it'll highlight the relationship and the hierarchy. So here when I click on this one, it's got a box around it, and I'll go down and I can see it down here. If I go down to body, it'll highlight the hierarchy, so you can say there's the header div, or sorry, it's not the header div, this is just the outside div. Here's my header div, there's its closing div, here's my navigation, here's my closing navigation, here's a div that I can put content in inside of here, here's my footer. And that's really nice. That's one of the things that I think is really helpful. And so you can start a web page off quite nicely. You got to go up and change and add some more, put your name and this kind of content here. But what I would do is I'm going to show you, once you have a web page much more filled out, it's got some really helpful tools. So for instance, if I go to a web page like this, I have a lot of content here. This is actually just a project web page. So this has a lot of the content in here. So for instance, I've got my doc type, I've got my meta content, my authorship, I've got my search features, my descriptions, my style sheets. Now I'm using the W3 school format for the W3 grid system. So I'm going to be using the rows and the containers and all that, so that I can use it for responsive. So I have my links to my W3, I have links to my Google fonts, and I have all of that up here in my head, just like I would normally. I have to enter that in. But one of the things that's nice is that when you want to add new content, it will give you helpful hints, and I'll get to that in just a second. One of the things that it does is that it actually allows you to collapse regions within a head. So here's my head region, and I can plus and open it up, and I can expand it. So the head region here, remember, it'll find its companion closing tag, which happens to be way down here. But I can close these things up. So I can go through and I can say, here's my div, it's my whole container div. I don't want to close that. But here's a header. I have a header row that contains some things. I can find the header row here, but I could collapse that, and I can just collapse up all those elements. If I hover over it, it'll kind of show me what's contained inside. But then I can kind of look and say, here's a row, here's a project overview row, here's my lecture note overview row. Everything that's inside of that is being hidden away, which is kind of nice. But let's say that I wanted to add a new piece of content right in here. This is something that I think is really nice. It's got what's called snippets, or it'll actually help you it'll show features. So say I'm going to begin with my left bracket, Then as I start to type, it's kind of searching for what I might be wanting. So if I want to put in a div, I'll say div, I'll double click it, I've got my opening closing div tags right there. I can put in my comments and saying this is a test div open, and this is my test div close, and I'm only putting that in there just in case I forget to remove it. And then once I have my divs defined, here's my opening. If I want to give it an ID, I'm going to move over, type in ID or just I, and it starts to pull that up. So I have my ID, and then it gives me my quotations test div. Okay. Now if I want to add a class, I can say class equals. Let's say that I want to define this in this particular case as a W3 container. I can put in W3, and it gives me this nice drop down list of things that I could choose from. Let's say container, and say that here is, and I'll give it a color. I'm going to say W3 indigo, or I could give it a color like, I'm just going to give it a color like red. Actually, that's I'll leave it there. Now if I control save this, and if I preview this, I think let me see, this gives me a nice preview here. This is actually just needs to be red. Control save. And I have the ability to give myself a nice little preview. I need to put some content inside of this, so I'm just going to put in a paragraph. It gives me the pair P. Notice that these things go when you don't close something, it gives you an error. It can give. Let me do that again. When I add a new element, if I don't close it, it'll give me an error. If this is empty, it'll give me you should trim this. So let's say that I didn't put in a closing tag. It might want to look for a closing tag element. I'm going to just test out to make sure I have something here. I'm going to tab over. I'm going to say test text. Here. I'm going to say save. And I can go to my preview, and here is my test text. Okay. I've got myself a nice container. I'm going to give myself, I've defined some color classes up here, and I know one of them is called blue, so I'm going to put in blue. Gives me the option here, so I'm just control save, go back to my preview, and here's that div right here. So I'm looking at what's called a preview, and in order to get that preview, I can click on this little icon, say show preview, and it'll show it in a new tab. So here's my page, here's that test one that I was looking at. If I wanted to preview that, I could say preview, and it'll render it out. So here's my test page here, that blank index page that I made right there. If I want to preview this one in my browser, I can go up here and say test in Firefox, and it'll pull up my web page here. So it's really quite nice. It's really a nice, I'm going to close my console out, nice feature. So those are some basic things that it can do. Let's look at some others.